In this video, I'm gonna give you a side-by-side comparison of Prime by Loop Community and Ableton Live. I often hear the question from worship leaders, which app should I use to run a click in tracks in worship? These are two amazing pieces of software that are designed for two different types of users, or you could say two different types of worship leaders. Keep watching this video to the end because you'll have clear direction on how to get started with using a click in tracks in worship using one of these pieces of software. This video is brought to you by Lead Worship with Ableton, a free training to help you get started with the #1 worship leading software. With Ableton Live, you can run a click, backing tracks, and automate lyrics and lighting. It's the best tool for increasing excellence and eliminating distracting mistakes in worship. Click the link in the description to enroll in the free training today. My name is Jake Goslin with Churchfront.com, an online resource for innovative and creative church leaders. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you can receive all of our latest content to help you grow yourself and grow your church. And make sure you check out the show notes below this video for some free resources and tools for your worship ministry. My question of the day, do you use Prime or Ableton Live? Let me know below in the comments. I'm really excited to do this side-by-side comparison of Prime and Ableton Live because I see this question so much in worship leader Facebook groups especially. People ask, should I use Prime or Ableton Live to run tracks and a click in worship? And then they get a bunch of replies and responses in the comment section on both sides. And that's because both pieces of software are amazing, but they're very different. And only you can decide which one's best for your context. So I'm gonna compare these pieces of software on the following criteria. First, price. Second, ease of use and just how fast can you get up and running with it. Third, we'll talk about its ability to just run a click in tracks. Fourth, we'll compare them in their ability to automate production elements in worship like lyrics, video, and lighting. And finally, we'll just talk about weekly prep time. I think those criteria cover most of the primary concerns worship leaders have when considering which software is right for them. So let's get behind my computer and we'll start this comparison. So I have my laptop here in front of me, and on it I have open both Prime by Loop Community and Ableton Live. And in each software, I have loaded in the same exact worship set. I think it's all exactly the same except for the very last song. And this will give you a great side-by-side comparison of these two pieces of software and the pros and cons of each one. First, I want to talk about price. So Prime is actually free to download and to use. You can download it in the Mac App Store or in the iOS App Store. There's no version of Prime available for Windows or Android. Ableton Live is a desktop only software. It can run on both Mac and PC, but you have to pay for it. So when you go to the Buy Now section at abletonlive.com, you can see the 3 different pricing levels they have. You can accomplish everything you need as a worship leader within Ableton Live, running a click, tracks, and automating lighting and lyrics with the intro version. So you'll at least have to spend $99 to get started with Ableton Live. I recommend when you have the budget for it, get the standard version. The suite version is built more for music producers and people who need more plugins and virtual instruments. It's kind of overkill if you're just using Ableton to run tracks like I do. And you're probably wondering, why is Prime free? Why does Ableton cost money? Well, these pieces of software were developed for different audiences. Prime was made for just worship leaders who are using it to run a click in tracks in a worship environment, which is awesome. It keeps it nice and simple. Ableton Live, on the other hand, is an advanced digital audio workstation. It's up there with Pro Tools and Logic Pro, and each of them have their own strengths. Ableton's strength in particular is not only producing music, so if you're a music producer, you just want to, record your own stuff, write your own stuff. Ableton Live's great for that, but it's also great for live playback and performance situations. So Ableton Live costs money because for Ableton, their primary business model is selling the software, whereas with Loop Community, they can provide the software for free and then they make money off of the tracks that you purchase from them. So Prime, it's free. Ableton Live, you have to spend at least $99. I recommend, though, getting the standard version, which will cost you $449. Let's talk about ease of use. This one's a pretty simple comparison. Prime is obviously much easier to get going with. You can just tell. Look at the user interface of Prime. It's very simple. You have your timeline up here with your different song sections. You have your list of songs right here. You have the individual tracks of the songs, and you can easily adjust, volume, turn
turn tracks on or off, solo tracks. You got your cues and click, you got play, stop. Very, very simple user interface. And it will only take you a few minutes to get used to this software and start loading in your tracks for worship. Ableton Live, on the other hand, because it's an advanced digital audio workstation, you get a lot more going on here. It has some of the similar concepts of Prime, especially when you're looking at Ableton Live and arrangement view here. You have a chronological timeline with your tracks laid out over time from left to right. But you can see in the way that I set up my project, I can actually see all of my individual audio stems for all the different backing track instruments, and also I just have other tracks going on here for my MIDI cues that cue up lyrics and lighting. And just overall, when you look at Ableton Live, it's kind of intimidating. You're like, oh, what does this do? With proper training, you can learn this. Anybody can learn this, but at first glance, it's not as intuitive as Prime. Now let's compare the functionality of these two pieces of software. First, just looking at their ability to run a click in tracks. Prime has come a long way over the past couple of years. Obviously, the feature of running a click alongside tracks isn't terribly difficult, and they're able to make that super easy to set up and run. But where the tricky part comes in is when you're trying to transitions between songs and worship, and that's really, really important for worship leaders. I know I care about that a lot because the little details make a huge difference in the overall flow and experience in worship. And in Prime, you now have all sorts of different ways you can transition between songs. You can overlap, you can crossfade, you can just have the click keep playing after the song for flow moments. I'm really impressed with their latest updates in this software. Ableton Live also can run a click in tracks, and the thing about Ableton is it does still give you a bit more control. This is a little bit hard to describe, so I'm just going to kind of show you some examples here, and hopefully it makes sense. So here in Prime, we have pads that we'll be playing towards the end of the sermon, and I'll just play this track for you here. And we like to have, pads softly playing underneath the end of the sermon, and then after the sermon prayer is done at the very end, our pastor says, hey, you can stand and worship. We like to automatically go into the next song. In Prime, I have to pretty much stop the pads track by just clicking the fade out or stop button. So usually I want to click the fade out. It's going to make it much smoother. It's going to fade it out, and then I have to click the next song and then press play. So it's a little bit clunky of a transition there. And now let's take a look at the same part of the set list in Ableton Live. So at the end of the sermon, we have pads playing. That's what this track is right here. It's just a very long audio file we have playing pads, because sometimes it's 5 minutes, sometimes it's 10 minutes, and it will just loop infinitely without us doing anything until we're ready to play the next song. So you have the pads playing in the background, and then when we're ready, pastor invites people to stand as we continue to worship. We just cue up the next song. You're going to see this locator queued up right here for "Oh Come to the Altar." It hits all of our MIDI cues for Pro Presenter and lighting, and then it goes right into counting off the next song.
5, 6.
So it's subtle things like that, because I'm working with one large timeline in arrangement view with Ableton Live, that just gives me quite a bit more control over some of these transitions and stuff. So it really comes in handy setting this up in Ableton when you're wanting to still have the metronome going at the right tempo and running pads looping in the background. All of this stuff can be set up just really seamlessly. But overall though, Prime really does do most of what Ableton can do in running just a click and backing tracks for your worship band. Now let's talk about the next major piece of functionality in comparing these two pieces of software, and that is automating other elements of your worship service, specifically the elements that you use in production for like lyrics, video, lighting. So we use Pro Presenter and MyDMX 3.0. Pro Presenter is our presentation software, MyDMX 3.0 is for lighting, and we're able to send those two pieces of software from Ableton Live using MIDI commands, using a MIDI network, and that for me is definitely one of the biggest reasons I use Ableton Live, because we have perfect lyric and lighting cues in our worship service. Prime, on the other hand, does not have the ability to do that, at least as of yet. This is June of 2018. Maybe in the future they're going to add this feature in. My only concern and question is how they'll be able to integrate adding all these cues into this user interface. Because the technology of sending and receiving MIDI commands isn't all that difficult. They already have Prime able to receive MIDI commands. When you look at the complexity of the user interface and workflow of setting up MIDI commands in Ableton Live, I'm just not sure how soon they'll be able to add the functionality into the Prime app for this type of thing. Because since I'm viewing my worship set list in this one cohesive timeline, not only am I able to queue up the right lyrics and lighting within songs themselves, but I can also queue up things during the times between songs. You know, it's not like I'm looking at one chunk of time like you see here on the different song tracks here in the Prime app. So someday I'm sure they will be adding this functionality to Prime. I have no clue what it would look like, so I'm not sure how I would design that myself, but it's going to be exciting if they ever do add that feature. Now let's talk about our weekly workflow and prep time that each of these pieces of software will take. Because Prime is so user-friendly and intuitive, it really only takes you a few minutes a week to build out your click and tracks. Ableton Live, on the other hand, it takes a little bit more work up front to prep all your songs the right way so that your week-to-week set list building is quick. Once I have my library of songs all prepped and formatted the way I want them, because each song, you know, alongside of having the backing tracks, I have markers, a tempo track, and some in my lyric cues. Once those things are built once, then they are ready to go every time you go to add that song into your set list. So my weekly prep, just to get the tracks into arrangement view and to get all the transitions and timing the way I want them down to the millisecond, probably takes me, I'd say, 20 minutes to a half hour to do that. And then it probably takes me another maybe 20 minutes to a half hour to drop in my lighting cues for that week. And if I need to prep a new song that we're doing, that maybe takes me 10 to 15 minutes. So if you're gonna use Ableton Live, I would try to budget at least 2 hours a week, especially if you are getting started with it. You're gonna get a lot quicker as you get used to the software. But in this category of prep time, obviously Prime is going to be a quick way to get going compared to Ableton, but again, with Ableton you have a lot of these more advanced features going on. So there's pros and cons to each side. So that concludes this comparison of the Prime app and Ableton Live, and I hope you understand now how these are fundamentally very different pieces of software, even though they have a lot of overlap in functionality. They're built for different audiences. Prime is built just for worship leaders, and it's built to be very simple, quick, and easy to use. Ableton Live, though, is built for worship leaders and many other categories of musicians and music producers. The downside of Prime's simplicity is the lack of advanced features. And the downside of Ableton Live's advanced features is it takes a bit more time to learn, and it takes a bit more time to prep on a weekly basis. But what matters most to me is that if you're a worship leader and you want to improve the excellence and sound of your band, use Prime, use Ableton Live, just use one of them. It doesn't matter which one. Just get started as soon as you possibly can. And if you do want the more advanced features of Ableton Live and you want to get started with that, I highly recommend you sign up for my free training, Lead Worship with Ableton. It's going to walk you through more details about the benefits of Ableton Live, a lot of the myths that worship leaders believe about it. I'll talk about the tools, both software and hardware, that you can use in a worship ministry context with Ableton Live to really reach its maximum potential. And finally, I'll share with you my 10-step implementation blueprint for getting up and running with Ableton Live at your church. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, please hit that thumbs up button, share this video with your friends in ministry, and don't forget to subscribe to the Churchfront channel so you can continue to receive all of our latest content to help you grow yourself and grow your church.